The transport ships hung in the orange sky like metal coffins waiting to be sealed, and the million humans standing below them had no idea what was about to happen to their lives. Commander Elena Vasquez watched from the front of the crowd as the Velthrani officer stepped out of the lead vessel, and his four eyes scanned the mass of humanity with something that looked like bored contempt, and she felt her stomach turn cold. The Velthrani were tall and thin with pale blue skin that seemed to shimmer in the strange light of this alien sun, and they had ruled over humanity for 3 generations since first contact, and they had always treated humans as useful tools and nothing more. "You have been selected for relocation," the officer announced through a translation device that made his voice sound flat and mechanical and empty of any feeling. Elena looked around at the people gathered here, and she saw miners and factory workers and their wives and husbands and their children, and she saw ordinary people who had spent their lives working in Velthrani facilities and earning just enough to survive. "Where are we being relocated to?" someone shouted from the crowd. The officer did not answer, and instead he gestured to his subordinates, who began herding people toward the transport ships, and Elena felt herself pushed forward by the mass of bodies, and she could hear children crying and adults asking questions that nobody would answer. The journey took 3 weeks in the cold metal belly of the transport ship, and Elena spent that time talking to the other humans and trying to understand what was happening, and she learned that all of them had one thing in common. They were all workers who had become unnecessary. The Velthrani had introduced new automation systems across their empire, and suddenly 1 million human laborers were no longer needed, and the cost of sending them back to Earth or resettling them on other colonies was apparently too high. Elena found Dr. Marcus Chen in one of the lower compartments where he was treating a child who had developed a fever, and he looked up at her with tired eyes, and she could see that he already suspected the truth. "They are not taking us somewhere better," he said quietly so the child would not hear. "No," Elena agreed, and she sat down beside him and watched him work. When the ships finally landed and the doors opened, Elena stepped out onto the surface of their new home, and she felt her knees buckle under a weight that pressed down on her entire body, and she realized the gravity here was much stronger than anything she had experienced before. The sky was the color of burnt copper, and the air tasted strange and slightly bitter on her tongue. And in the distance, she could see forests of twisted black trees and mountains that seemed to scrape against the clouds. The Velthrani officer appeared one last time, and his face showed no emotion as he delivered his final message. "This planet is designated XR7749, and it contains sufficient resources for survival and hegemony. Thanks you for your service and wishes you well in your new home." Then the ships lifted off, and Elena watched them shrink to dots and then disappear entirely. And around her, 1 million people stood in stunned silence as they realized they had been thrown away like garbage. "What is this place?" someone whispered. Elena pulled out a small datapad that one of the Velthrani guards had dropped, and she accessed the planetary survey files, and what she read made her blood run cold. XR7749 had been surveyed and rejected for colonization because it was classified as a Category 5 death world, and the report listed dozens of reasons why no intelligent species should ever try to live here. The gravity was nearly 1.5 times Earth standard, which would put enormous strain on human hearts and bones and joints, and the atmosphere contained trace toxins that would cause slow organ damage over time. And the native life forms included predators of extreme size and aggression. The plants were mostly poisonous, and the weather patterns included storms that carried acidic rain, and the bacteria and parasites were completely foreign to human immune systems. Elena looked up from the datapad and saw Dia Chun reading over her shoulder, and his face had gone pale. "They sent us here to die," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. Elena did not respond because there was nothing to say, and instead, She climbed up onto a nearby rock and looked out at the crowd of terrified humans, and she knew that someone had to take charge or they would all die in chaos. "Listen to me," she shouted, and her voice carried across the crowd, and people turned to look at her. "The Velthrani have abandoned us on a planet. They believe will kill us, and maybe they are right, and maybe most of us will die here, but I refuse to give them the satisfaction of dying quietly." She paused and looked at the faces staring up at her, and she saw fear and anger and despair. But she also saw something else, and it looked like the first spark of determination. "We have supplies for 6 months. If we are careful, and we have doctors and engineers and scientists among us, and we have something the Velthrani never understood about humanity." "What is that?" someone called out. Alina smiled grimly and pointed at the hostile wilderness surrounding them. "We adapt and we survive, and we have been doing it for 100,000 years on a planet that tried to kill us with ice ages and plagues and natural disasters. And we are still here." She jumped down from the rock and began organizing people into groups and assigning tasks, and within hours the first camp was taking shape, and people were working together because working together was the only chance they had. That night Alina stood on a ridge overlooking the camp, and she could see fires burning and hear the sounds of construction, and somewhere in the darkness, something huge was moving through the trees and watching them with hungry eyes. Dior Chun climbed up to stand beside her, and they both listened to the alien sounds of the night. "Do you really think we can survive here?" he asked. Alina thought about the question for a long moment, and then she turned to face the doctor. "I think we have no choice but to try, and I think the Velthrani made a mistake when they decided to throw us away, because they forgot that humans are the most stubborn species in the galaxy." She looked back at the camp where 1,000,000 people were fighting against despair and beginning the long, hard work of staying alive. "We will make them regret this decision," she said quietly into the darkness, and somewhere in the night, the predators circled closer, and the death world waited to see what these strange new creatures would do. The first year on the death world was exactly as terrible as the Velthrani had planned, and the humans died in numbers that would have broken the spirit of any other species. They called it the dying time, and those who survived would tell stories about it for generations to come. The predators came first, and they came in packs of 20 or 30 at a time, and they were reptilian creatures the size of trucks with teeth like swords, and they could smell human blood from miles away. Samuel Okonkwo had been a mining foreman before the abandonment, but now he led the defense teams, and he watched helplessly as the creatures tore through the outer camps and dragged screaming people into the darkness. "We cannot fight them with what we have," he told Alina after the third attack in a single week. "Then we learn how they hunt, and we become better hunters," she replied. "The gravity crushed them slowly and steadily, and hearts that had evolved for Earth gave out under the constant strain, and people collapsed while walking or working or sleeping, and Dr. Chen performed more autopsies in that first year than he had in his entire career. The plants looked edible, but most of them were poison, and families who tried to stretch their rations by foraging died in agony as toxins destroyed their organs from the inside. The parasites were perhaps the worst because they were invisible, and they burrowed into human flesh and laid eggs that hatched into larvae that ate their hosts alive. By the end of the first year, 200,000 humans had died, and the survivors gathered to count their losses, and many of them wanted to simply give up and wait for death. But Alina refused to let them surrender. "Every person who died taught us something," she told the assembled survivors, and her voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but still strong. "We know now which predators hunt at night, and which hunt at dawn, and we know which plants will kill us and which ones might save us, and we know that the parasites cannot survive in temperatures above boiling." She held up a journal filled with handwritten notes and observations. "This is what our dead have given us, and we will not waste their sacrifice." The second year was still hard, but fewer people died, and the humans began to learn the rhythms of their hostile home. Dr. Chun discovered that certain native fungi could be processed into antibiotics that fought the alien infections, and engineer Yuki Tanaka designed pressurized suits that helped human bodies cope with the crushing gravity. Samuel Okonkwo studied the predators until he knew their behavior better than they knew themselves, and he trained hunting parties that began to turn the tables on the creatures that had been feeding on human flesh. They're not as smart as they are dangerous, he reported to the council after his teams killed their first pack of the reptilian hunters. They follow patterns, and they can be predicted, and they can be killed. By the third year, the humans had stopped being prey and started becoming predators themselves. The children adapted fastest, and this surprised everyone at first. But then Dr. Chun explained that young bodies were more flexible and more capable of change. Boys and girls who had been toddlers during the landing grew up in the heavy gravity, and their bones became dense like stone, and their muscles developed in ways that would have been impossible on Earth. A 10-year-old child born on the death world could lift weights that would have injured an adult from the old days, and they could run for hours without getting tired, and their lungs processed the toxic air more efficiently than anyone had thought possible. They are becoming something new, Dr. Chun told Elena as they watched a group of children playing in the camp. The children were wrestling and laughing and moving with a speed and power that seemed almost inhuman. They are becoming what this planet needs them to be, Elena replied. By the 5th year, the population had stabilized at 600,000, and people had stopped dying faster than they were being born. The humans built permanent settlements with walls that kept out the predators, and they farmed a few plants that were not poisonous, and they hunted the creatures that had once hunted them. They named their world Crucible, because a crucible was a container where metals were melted and purified by extreme heat, and that was exactly what this planet was doing to humanity. By the 10th year, the population had started to grow again, and the settlements had spread across the continent. And the humans had become something the Velthrani never could have imagined. They'd become the most dangerous thing on a planet full of dangerous things. Elena was getting old now, and the gravity had worn down her body, but she still climbed to the ridge every evening to look out at what her people had built. Dr. Chun joined her on the night of the 10th anniversary, and they stood together in silence for a long moment. "We did it," he said finally. Elena shook her head slowly. "No, and this is just the beginning, because surviving is not enough." She pointed up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the copper sky. Somewhere out there, the Velthrani are going about their lives, and they have probably forgotten we ever existed, and they think they got away with murder. Her old eyes were hard as she stared into the darkness of space. Our grandchildren will remind them. 50 years had passed since the abandonment, and the world called. Crucible had transformed humanity in ways that the original survivors could never have predicted. Governor Yuki Tanaka II stood on the balcony of the Capitol building and looked out over a city of 300,000 people, and she thought about her grandmother, who had been one of the engineers in the first camp. The city was called New Dawn, and it spread across a valley that had once been hunting ground for the great reptilian predators, and now those same predators were either extinct or domesticated, and humans walked the streets without fear. The people walking below her were not the same as the humans who had been dumped here 50 years ago, and the difference was visible to anyone who looked closely. They were shorter on average, because compact bodies handled the gravity better, and they were built like tanks with broad shoulders and thick limbs packed with muscle that had adapted to the constant crushing weight. Their skin had darkened slightly to handle the radiation from the alien sun, and their eyes had changed too, with pupils that could adjust to the strange light conditions faster than any Earth human could manage. But the physical changes were only part of the transformation. The children of Crucible grew up knowing that their ancestors had been thrown away like trash, and this knowledge burned in them like a fire that never went out. They trained from childhood in combat and survival, because the elders made sure that every generation remembered the dying time and understood that strength was the only thing that kept them alive. A 12-year-old child of Crucible could outfight most adult soldiers from any other human colony, and they could survive in wilderness conditions that would kill trained Marines from Earth within days. "Governor, we have completed the latest test flight," said Admiral Marcus Chun II as he entered the balcony. He was the grandson of the original Dr. Chun, and he had inherited his grandfather's sharp mind, along with the new physical gifts that Crucible had given his generation. Yuki turned to face him, and she saw the excitement barely contained behind his professional expression. "Show me," she said. They walked together to a secure facility hidden in the mountains north of the city, and what Yuki saw there made her heart pound with pride and anticipation. The warship Remembrance hung in the massive underground hangar, and it was beautiful in a brutal and functional way, and it represented 50 years of secret work by the best engineers and scientists on Crucible. The original survivors had salvaged every piece of Velthrani technology from the supply drops and the abandoned equipment, and they had spent decades taking it apart and understanding it, and then improving upon it. "The slipspace drive is fully operational," Marcus reported as they stood beneath the massive vessel. "We have tested it with unmanned probes, and we can reach Velthrani space within 2 weeks." Yuki reached out and touched the cold metal hull of the ship, and she thought about all the people who had died so that this moment could happen. "How many ships do we have now?" she asked. 47 combat-ready vessels with crews trained and waiting, and another 60 in various stages of construction. Yuki nodded slowly, and she felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The council had debated for years about what to do. When this moment finally came, and some had argued for peaceful contact and negotiation, and others had demanded immediate revenge. In the end, they had decided to prepare for both possibilities because the people of Crucible had learned that hope was good, but strength was better. "The Velthrani have probably forgotten we exist," Yuki said quietly. The records show that they classified the XR7749 operation as a minor labor reallocation, and they deleted most of the files 20 years ago. Marcus smiled grimly. "They will remember soon enough." Yuki turned away from the ship and looked at the young admiral. "My grandmother told me something before she died, and she said that survival was never the goal, and it was only the first step." "What was the goal?" Marcus asked. "Justice," Yuki replied simply. She walked toward the exit, and Marcus fell into step beside her. "Begin final preparations for the fleet, and I want every ship ready to launch within 6 months. Where will we go first?" Yuki paused at the door and looked back at the warship that represented everything her people had suffered and learned and become. "We will go to the Velthrani border, and we will announce ourselves, and we will give them one chance to acknowledge what they did and make it right. And if they refuse?" Yuki's expression hardened, and in that moment she looked exactly like the photographs of Commander Elena Vasquez that hung in every home on Crucible. "Then we will teach them what happens when you try to kill humanity and fail." She walked out into the mountain air, and above her, the copper sky was filled with stars, and somewhere among those stars, the Velthrani hegemony was about to receive a message from the dead. The people they had thrown away were coming home. The Velthrani scout vessel Eternal Vigilance was on routine patrol near the border when its sensors detected something that should have been impossible. Commander Thesic stared at his display screen, and his 4 eyes blinked in confusion as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. 47 ships had emerged from slipspace, and they were using technology that matched Velthrani designs, but the configurations were wrong, and the energy signatures were different, and nothing in his database could identify them. "Unknown vessels, this is Commander Thesic of the Velthrani hegemony, and you are entering controlled space, and identify yourselves immediately," he transmitted. The response came in perfect Velthrani. trade language, but the accent was strange, and the voice carried a cold edge that made Desik uncomfortable. "This is Admiral Marcus Chen, the second of the Crucible Expeditionary Force, and we are here to discuss a matter of historical significance with your government." Desik felt something cold spread through his body, because the name Crucible meant nothing to him, but the word Chun triggered a memory from an old classified briefing. "I am not familiar with any system called Crucible," he replied carefully. "You knew it as XR7749. The voice responded. "You sent 1 million humans there 60 years ago, and you expected them to die. And they did not." Desik's hands trembled as he accessed the restricted historical archives. And what he found made his blood run cold. The XR7749 operation had been classified and sealed, and officially deleted from all public records, and the few remaining files described it as a minor labor reallocation with no survivors expected. "There must be some mistake," Desik said, and his voice was not as steady as he wanted it to be. "The only mistake was made by your government 60 years ago, and now we are here to correct it, and you will take us to your leaders." The shuttle that docked with the Eternal Vigilance carried a diplomatic party of 12 humans, and when they stepped onto the deck of the Velthrani ship, every guard in the hangar took an involuntary step backward. The humans were wrong somehow, and Desik could not identify exactly what made them so disturbing, but his instincts screamed danger every time he looked at them. They were shorter than the humans in the old records, but they moved with a fluid power that seemed barely contained, and their eyes tracked everything in the room with the focused attention of predators evaluating prey. The leader introduced herself as Ambassador Elena Vasquez III, and she was the great-granddaughter of the commander who had led the original survivors. "My ancestor wanted me to deliver a message to your government," she said, and her dark eyes fixed on Desik with an intensity that made him want to look away. "We survived, and now we want to discuss reparations." Desik escorted the diplomatic party to the capital world, and during the journey he observed the humans carefully, and what he saw terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced. They moved through the standard gravity of his ship as if it were nothing, and he learned that they had grown up in gravity, nearly 50% stronger than what Velthrani considered comfortable. They ate the emergency rations meant for Velthrani soldiers and showed no signs of illness from the alien proteins, and when Desik asked how this was possible, the ambassador simply smiled. "We learned to eat anything that did not kill us immediately, and eventually, very little could kill us at all." The Gemini Council received the delegation in the Great Chamber on the capital station, and the 12 senior administrators of the Velthrani Empire looked down from their elevated seats at the small group of humans standing before them. High Administrator Volvo spoke first, and his voice dripped with the arrogance of 300 years of unchallenged power. "We have reviewed your claims, and we find no evidence of any wrongdoing, and the XR7749 relocation was a lawful administrative action within hegemony protocols." Ambassador Vasquez nodded slowly, as if she had expected this response. "I see, and so you deny any responsibility for the deaths of 400,000 humans who died in the first decade alone. Those deaths, if they occurred, were the result of natural environmental factors and not any action by the hegemony." Velthos replied smoothly. "The relocation was conducted according to proper procedures, and your ancestors signed the standard waiver forms." Elena stepped forward, and 2 guards moved to intercept her, but she was faster than they expected, and she had crossed half the distance to the council seats before anyone could react. "My great-grandmother kept a list," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire chamber. "Every name of every person who died in the dying time was recorded, and we still read that list every year on the anniversary of the abandonment." She looked up at the council members, and none of them could meet her eyes. 400,000 names, and it takes 3 days to read them all, and every child on Crucible knows at least one of those names. High Administrator Velthos shifted uncomfortably in his bose seat. What exactly do you want? He asked. We want acknowledgement of what was done, and we want compensation for the survivors and their descendants. And we want guarantees that this will never happen to any species again. Velthos laughed, and the flies laughed, and the sound echoed through the chamber. And if we refuse these demands? Ambassador Vasquez smiled, and it was the same smile her great-grandmother had worn when she stood on that ridge 60 years ago and watched the transport ships disappear. Then, you will learn why death worlds make the most dangerous enemies. She turned and walked out of the chamber, and her delegation followed, and the council members watched them go in silence. They are bluffing, Velthos said finally. They have 47 ships against our thousands, and they cannot possibly threaten the hegemony. But some of the other council members were not so sure, because they had seen the way those humans moved, and they had seen the look in their eyes. They had seen what Crucible had made of humanity, and they were afraid. The war began 3 days after the diplomatic mission returned to the fleet, and it ended 93 days later with the complete surrender of the Velthrani. Hegemony High Administrator Velthos had been confident in the superiority of Velthrani military power, and he had sent a battle group of 200 ships to destroy the human fleet and teach these upstart survivors their place. The battle lasted 4 hours, and when it was over, 170 Velthrani vessels had been destroyed, and the rest were fleeing back to the capital in terror. Admiral Marcus Chun watched the enemy retreat and felt no satisfaction, because this was not about glory or conquest, but about something far more important. How did they do it? The Velthrani commanders asked each other in the aftermath. The answer was simple, but they could not understand it because they had never faced an enemy like the humans of Crucible. Velthrani soldiers trained in simulations and controlled environments, and they learned to fight by following procedures and protocols, and they had conquered dozens of species using these methods. The humans of Crucible had grown up on a planet where everything wanted to kill them, and they had spent their entire lives fighting for survival against creatures that made Velthrani warriors look like children. A Crucible Marine could operate in combat conditions that would have killed a Velthrani soldier within minutes, and they could endure injuries that would have been fatal to any normal human, and they kept fighting even when every logical analysis said they should have been dead. The war spread across Velthrani space as the Crucible fleet grew stronger with every victory, and subject species who had been conquered by the hegemony rose up against their masters when they saw that the Velthrani could be defeated. Planet after planet fell as the humans pressed forward with a cold and patient fury that seemed to have no limit, and the Velthrani discovered that they had created their own worst enemy. On the 75th day of the war, Admiral Chen led a strike force to the planet where the original abandonment orders had been signed, and he walked through the empty administrative building until he found the office of the bureaucrat who had authorized the XR7749 operation. The bureaucrat was long dead, but Chen stood in that office for a long moment and thought about his grandfather, who had watched so many people die in the first years on Crucible. We remember, he said quietly to the empty room. The final battle took place above the Velthrani capital station, and the hegemony threw everything they had left into the defense, but it was not enough. Crucible Marines boarded the station and fought their way through corridors that had never seen combat, and the Velthrani guards could not stop them no matter how hard they tried. Admiral Chun walked into the council chamber where the diplomatic mission had been rejected 3 months earlier, and this time the council members did not look down from elevated seats. They were standing at ground level with their hands raised in surrender, and their 4 eyes showed an emotion that the Velthrani had not felt in centuries. Fear. The hegemony surrenders unconditionally, High Administrator Velthos said, and his voice trembled. We accept your terms, whatever they may be. Chen looked at the fallen rulers of an empire that had once seemed invincible, and he felt the weight of 60 years of suffering pressing down. On this moment, you threw us away because we were inconvenient. He said, you chose the cruelest planet you could find and expected it to do your killing for you, and instead it made us into something you could never have imagined. He paused and looked at each council member in turn. The galaxy will know what you did, and every species you have conquered, and every world you have exploited will know that the mighty Velthrani hegemony was brought down by the people they considered garbage. Velthos lowered his head in shame. What will you do with use? Chun turned to look out the window at the stars, and somewhere among them was Crucible, the death world that had forged humanity into something new. We will not become what you were. He said finally, we will not build an empire on the suffering of others, and we will not throw away people who become inconvenient. He turned back to face the council. The hegemony is dissolved, and every subject species will be granted independence. And Crucible will serve as protector of the abandoned and defender of those the powerful would discard. The news spread across the galaxy within days, and species who had lived under Velthrani rule for generations learned that they were free, and they learned who had freed them. The humans from the death world became legends, and stories were told about them in 1,000 languages on 1,000 worlds, and every story carried the same message. Do not underestimate humanity, because what does not kill them only makes them more dangerous. On Crucible itself, the descendants of the original survivors gathered on the ridge where Commander Elena Vasquez had once stood and watched the transport ships disappear. Governor Yuki Tanaka II stood at the front of the crowd, and she held a copy of the list that had been kept since the dying time, and she began to read the names of everyone who had died so that this day could happen. It took 3 days to read all the names, and when she finished, the sun was setting, and the copper sky was filled with stars. We did not forget, she said. We survived, and we grew strong, and we came back, and we made them answer for what they did. She looked up at the stars and thought about all the worlds that were now free because of what her people had endured. This is what humanity does. She said, we adapt and we overcome, and we never ever give up. The crowd dispersed slowly, and people returned to their homes in the city that had grown up around the Laws' original landing site, and life continued on the world that had tried so hard to kill them. But something had changed in the galaxy, because everyone now knew that there was a species out there that could survive anything, and that carried grudges across generations, and that never stopped until justice was done. The Velthrani had wanted to create a grave for 1 million unwanted humans, and instead they had created a crucible that forged the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever seen. And somewhere in the darkness of space, the other powers of the galaxy made quiet notes in their records. Never abandon humans on a death world, because they might just become its apex predators.